Bob Morgan, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am so excited to have you in this conversation.
Mahan, thank you for having me. It's always a great opportunity to share some stories in life, and hopefully inspire some people, and have people learn from my lessons learned. And so I appreciate you just giving me the opportunity to come on and talk with you.
Well, you're an incredibly successful business person, have had a great impact with everything you've done and the many things you're doing right now. And we're going to get to some of those. But first off, you grew up milking cows in PA. Tell me a little bit about that childhood and how that impacted the kind of leader and person you became.
Yeah, people always ask me, well, where did you grow up? Because I launched Morgan Franklin and built that, and now I'm in the film business, and then I tell them, I'm like, well, I grew up on a dairy farm milking cows. They're like, what? uh, but no, I very, be honest with you, like having the opportunity to live in Washington D.C. in the region and travel around the world and do those kinds of things, all fantastic. But having the ability to grow up in a rural farming community. I couldn't have asked for more. I grew up, and my grandfather had a 330-acre dairy farm in South Central Pennsylvania. And as a kid, your one of your early jobs is to get up at 4:30 in the morning and go milk cows, and then eat a good hearty breakfast, and then go bale hay and work all day, and then milk the cows at night. And I grew up doing that. My grandfather was my first exposure to an entrepreneur. My dad also had his own business. So I grew up in an environment where people just, you ran your own business. And I learned lessons from both my dad and my grandfather in different aspects. It's funny, my grandfather probably worked too much and spent too much time on the farm. My dad probably spent too much time taking care of his family and probably could have focused a little bit more time on his business. So, throughout my career, I've tried to like be somewhere in the middle, on average. But I learned a lot of valuable lessons just about life, about how to treat people, how to manage, how to deal with problems. Both of them were great teachers, and it kind of paved the way for me that when the opportunity came to start a business, I'm like, what's the worst thing that could happen? I've already seen it. I've already went through it. So yeah, it was great. I just recently purchased the farm from my mom to keep the 330-acre farm in the family, but no desire to go back to milking cows.
But it's interesting because a lot of farmers want their kids to grow up or their grandchildren to grow up and also farm and keep that alive. But it sounds like your grandfather wanted you to move on beyond farming.
Well, he would have loved if I'd have taken over the farm. He only had one daughter. She was not going to take over the farm. I was the one grandson who gravitated to working on the farm, and there was some pressure there. But I was actually at a point in my life when I was at Penn State struggling with. I was diagnosed with cancer, and I was dealing with a lot of things, and I just wasn't quite sure. I wanted to go back to school when I thought, well, I'll just take over the farm. And it was one of those pivotal moments in my life where he just put his arm around me and said, you know, I want you to chase your dream. This farm has been my dream. It's come true. It's a fantastic place to live, work, but you should chase your dream. And just not having that pressure from him gave me the freedom and flexibility to really sit back and think, it's like, okay, I'll go back to school, get my engineering degree. And, but for that short, very short conversation, I'd probably still be back there milking cows as to now, building a company and working in national security and making films. So it's amazing what a 30-second conversation can do for your life.
A powerful 30-second conversation, but you also alluded to it while you were this young man at Penn State pursuing electrical engineering, you were diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah. Summer of between my, um, going into my sophomore year, I was diagnosed with cancer. One of those experiences that, I laugh about now, but, you know, I, I, I noticed there was a problem for about 2 months. Had no clue what to do. Fortunately, my mom was a nurse, and I went to my mom. I said, I think something's wrong. She took me to a very good local doctor. His bedside manner wasn't all that to be cracked up about, and he he checks me and he says, "Well, you either have a hydrocele or you have cancer." It's like that. I'm like, "Cancer?" And then lo and behold, the next day I'm being checked by an oncologist. 24 hours later, I'm in surgery. They're removing a tumor. 2 weeks later, they do another massive invasive surgery to check all my lymph nodes. And that really, kicked off this journey throughout my entire college career. Not, while most kids are off going to college and studying and having a good time, I'm going to monthly CAT scans and chest x-rays and blood work. And, at 2 years, they told me I would be okay. And then on the 24th month checkup, it came back. So I ended up, again, all these kind of lessons in my personal life ended up, being great lessons in my business life. And I ended up at the University of Maryland and had some of the best treatment in the world. And the number three doctor in the country on my case, they gave me a chemotherapy that just absolutely wrecked me mentally and physically. But everything was okay. And they said, "You're good to go." Sure enough, 4 months later, it came back again. And
Wow.
it stupefied the doctors because at that point in time, only the 10th case ever to have it come back for a third time. Turns out they did an MRI, they found another tumor, they removed the tumor, and they embarked on more um, chemotherapy. But the lesson that I learned from that is no matter how qualified my doctor was, he had the self awareness to reach out to two of the other top experts in the field in testicular cancer. He reached out to Sloan Kettering, and he reached out to the doctor who created the chemotherapy regimen. That just taught me a very valuable lesson. It's like no matter how good you think you are, how smart you know you are, it never hurts to go out and talk to somebody else to get their perspective. And lo and behold, the doctors are actually arguing on how to treat me. And it ultimately, I ended up having to choose, right, the treatment course based on feedback from these three different doctors. And fortunately, I chose correctly, and I survived and have now been cured for over 30 years. So life is good. But yeah, it was one of those defining moments that taught me a lot about life, gave me perspective on a lot of different things as I embarked on my college career, my professional career, and starting a business. So
And talk about the worst of unexpected things being thrown at you repeatedly at such a young age, where you have to have the wisdom and the courage to keep battling it over and over and over again.
yeah, it really at that age it teaches you about resiliency. Um, you know, but ultimately, in the space I'm in now, working on mental wellness and mental fitness for our charity Pivotal Moments. I'll be honest with you. I look back and realize that I had some severe issues mentally going forward. While I know I handled it well and I had the right perspective, there were still some lingering things throughout my entire adult life that I was still dealing with that I hadn't really hadn't known about up until recently. So those kind of moments in your life I think are defining. I think we were talking earlier about this ability to fight through adversity. No different than weightlifting or exercising or breaking a bone. When it heals, it gets stronger, right? It really did make me this. My mom now, she refers to me as the Rock because I handled it. I was always laughing about it. I never showed anything. That may not have been so healthy either, but at the time, it does set a tone for your life. It's like if I can handle that, I could pretty much handle anything.
Yes,
So
yes. So you are the rock, and you also had the rock of your life, your childhood sweetheart, Tammy, standing by you all through that time and eventually all through your professional life as you helped build Morgan Franklin.
yeah, she needs to be put up for sainthood for everything I've put her through. Uh, look, success never. never comes by yourself. It always takes a team. And I'll be honest with you, there aren't too many young women who would, leave their university, drive 2 hours to sit by my bedside to watch me go through chemotherapy. Usually, in a drug induced coma, not even speaking to her, which she did for way too many trips. And then we were told that we weren't going to be able to have children. So here she is at the age of 20 looking at a future with no kids. So it takes a special person to be able to kind of fight through that. Now, miracles do happen. A few years later, unbeknownst to us, we had a miracle baby. Our oldest son, Andrew, came to us, and then I ended up with two more boys. So the cancer didn't prevent me from having kids. It just prevented me from having girls, I think. So, but now, and then, we're actually rolling out a content channel on our Pivotal Moments program called Her Journey. It's a story about, the stories for women who have to, their journey through life and fighting through adversity and those kind of things. And one of the things, I learned when supporting the military is like, you know, I went out every day. My wife gave up her career so I could build a company. And, and there are times when she feels like she hasn't done enough. I'm like, and she just said that to me yesterday, like, you did all this. I said, no, 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 we did all this. I said, but for you staying home and not just taking care of the kids, like, she's the house commander. She takes care of everything. So I can go off, build businesses, create, do the things that I do. I couldn't have done any of those things without her. So it really is a team effort. She probably had more responsibility managing than I did. So special, very special person.
And it is having that supportive partner that helped you get through all of that. Now, you start initially working on communication systems, and you are dealing with Navy SEALs and a Navy SEAL commander.
Oh yeah. So I grew up in rural Pennsylvania on a dairy farm, right? So now I'm, working in Maryland, and they assigned me to this new project for the Navy SEALs, and you hear about them. So we drive to this remote location. We walk into a warehouse, and these group of 7 or 8 guys come walking out of the back, and they're in khaki pants and polo shirts, and some have beards and some have hats on. I'm like, when are the Navy guys going to show up? and and this gentleman steps forward and never shakes my hand. He looks at the gentleman that I'm working for. He said, "Who's he? What does he know?" And finally, he looks back at me, and he still never shakes my hand. He just says, "I just want you to know that if your work fails, we die." And that's it. And I'm sitting there at 22 going, wow, what world did I just walk into? But when you ultimately, it taught me that, there is no space for mediocrity. There is no, they always had this thing, failure is not an option, which, yes, failure is not an option, but doesn't mean that mistakes can't happen. It's really about resiliency and how you respond to mistakes. But it taught me very early on at 22 that I was doing something very, very important. It wasn't the farm anymore. And, my work had consequences. And, we ended up carrying that mantra as we built Morgan Franklin that says, if we can do work for the president of the United States, we can do work for Navy SEALs at that level. We need to treat every client like that. So failure is not an option for any of our clients. Mediocrity is not an option for any of our clients. And that's how we built the company. That was kind of embedded in our culture. And it all came from that very first conversation that I had.
So that became a pillar. And you also had an experience in the White House communications office with the communications officer, where you had made a mistake and how that mistake was handled.
Yeah, that's a very valuable lesson. Like, we all want to prove ourselves. And there are times when you probably, try to BS your way out of a situation, and there's a problem that occurred. Unfortunately, this problem wasn't that serious. It didn't impact the president's ability to communicate. But I did try to BS a problem that we were having and tried to convince this particular officer that we had it on, that everything was fine. And he had the same background that I did, although he had a master's in electrical engineering. So fortunately for me, he pulled me aside. He put his arm around me. He says, "Just let you know," he goes, "don't ever try to BS me again." He goes, "I have a master's in double E." He goes, "I know exactly what you're talking about." He goes, "My advice," and it was a learning moment, and that's why I love that guy, because he took it as a teaching moment for me, because at the time I was still only 24 years old, and I'm modernizing communication systems for the president of the United States. I still had a lot to learn, and he said, "Just remember, just it doesn't hurt to admit that there's a problem, but when you do, come with answers and possible solutions and a path forward." He goes, "You're not," he goes, "we all make mistakes." And that was a very valuable lesson, because you're working at the highest levels of the government with the special forces in the White House. You don't want to make a mistake. And I had just been told that if we make a mistake, people die. So, you're trying to walk your way out of this. And fortunately, he was very gracious about it. But it was a good teaching moment for me. And again, one of those things where we embedded that into the culture at Morgan Franklin. It's like we told everybody early on our new hire orientation, the three owners would get up and speak for about 2 hours. And I always impressed and said, nobody's ever going to get fired from Morgan Franklin for making a mistake. Because the reality is we're pushing the envelope. We're building this plane as we fly it. People are going to make mistakes. We're going to ask you to do things that you've never done before. You're going to make mistakes. But if you come to us and you start blaming everybody else, that's probably what will get you fired.
And I think one of the elements that made you a great and more effective, one of the elements that made you an effective leader, Bob, is the fact that you're a great storyteller. Because organizational culture is built on telling and retelling stories that communicate values of that organization. And through telling these stories of lessons you have learned and the importance of certain elements, including being accountable, owning up to mistakes, you communicated what should be the culture at Morgan Franklin.
Oh yeah, we love telling stories. We told stories every chance we get, and again, some of them were cultural related. Like you wanted to impress upon, everybody in the organization is like, this is who we are, and the best way to visualize that is through actions and deeds of the past, right? The history teaches us those things, but it's also too an opportunity to educate. And particularly for me, we were never shy. We just in our new hire orientation, we said, look, we've never started a company before. This is our first one. So we're going to make mistakes. We're going to be the first ones. I'm telling you right now, I made 5 mistakes before I got up here and spoke. So, don't, if you're coming in here and thinking everything is baked out, like we've got every policy, every procedure, everything locked down, that's not going to happen. And if you're really not comfortable in that environment, you may want to go work somewhere else, because we're flying a little loose. We haven't done this before. But if you enjoy a roller coaster ride, which is really what it was, this wild, crazy roller coaster ride that you sometimes had no idea where you were going to go, then this is the place to be. And, it became a culture of push the envelope. If we would have said, we have never done that before, so we're not going to do it, we would have never grown from 10 employees to over 500. We would have sat at 10. So, uh, but the only way to get people over that hurdle is to tell them the stories about how you signed up to do a project for NRL that you had no clue how you were going to execute and get it done, but did, and those stories actually prove to people when you hire them and new clients and all those other things, that when you say you can do something, you do it because you've got stories to back it up.
So then what was it initially that gave you the idea to want to start Morgan Franklin specifically? You had tried your hand at different things, and then this is the idea you came up with.
Um, could you repeat that? Because there was a
What?
little glitch there.
Yeah, yeah, no problem at all. So what gave you the idea for launching Morgan Franklin?
Um, it was a little bit of Timing. There was a situation with my client at the White House Communications Agency. I worked for the government, so they basically hired us and our contractors to do work for them. Somewhere along the lines, things got crossed up, and somebody came out with a directive and said you can no longer send money to that government organization. You have to use these contractors over here. They came to me and said, look, if you want to continue, we want you to continue working on our programs and doing what you're doing. You just have to go work for a company like Booz Allen Hamilton or SAIC or one of the other, government contracts in and around the Beltway. And, having grown up with my grandfather and my dad, I'm like, well, okay, I've been basically running my own business within the government. I went back to him. I said, would you consider, hiring if I created a company? And they ironically said yes. But again, that's where you learn that if you do great work and people trust you and you deliver, they're going to hire you no matter what capacity. So I got a couple of guys and we said, let's go build this company. And that's what got it started. But it was the seeds were planted for me way back as a kid with working for my grandfather and see his innovation. And then my dad, he brought the balance to the business side. He was a huge family guy. He would get a client to call him and he'd go, you know what, I'll can you fix it yourself? I'll teach you how to do it over the phone because I've got plans to take my kids to the lake, right? Which is again a great perspective, right? Keeping what's important, but that all led to that moment in time, right? Luck is, what the luck is, the combination of being prepared and having the opportunity to present itself. I was just mentally prepared to make that jump at the time. I had the folks at the White House willing to take a chance. Now, they gave us a 3-month contract to prove ourselves. So I basically quit my job, entered into a 3-month contract to prove ourselves. And, fortunately we did. But, they gave us a shot. And now, ironically, and I tell this to entrepreneurs all the time. I said, look, your business plan, it's great that you do a business plan, but I can guarantee you the moment you print it, it's going to be off. And we launched the company and I convinced my brother to leave his, fast track career at PricewaterhouseCoopers to come in as CFO. And our first client was a joint venture between British Telecom and AT&T. It had nothing to do with national security. So our business plan was off from day one, but it gave us the opportunity to grow this very balanced company with, long-term national security contracts, and then very lucrative short-term, high-risk commercial consulting opportunities. And we found a way to make that work and grow. And both of them grew almost equally over time. And, but yeah, that was, that opportunity. And again, I'll be honest with you, I attribute a lot of that to overcoming cancer. Like people go, wow, how did you leave that job and take a risk on a 3-month contract? I'm like, what's the worst thing that could happen? I had cancer. I thought I was going to die. Like it. So to me, in my head, I'm like, this isn't that risky. Fortunately, I convinced some other people. So I'm good at convincing people to jump into crazy stuff.
Well, you are willing to take chances and take a risk, but you also prioritize the right things. Pretty early on in starting Morgan Franklin, there was one of the initial employees, one of the first hires, that had committed a serious violation, and you had a choice on how you would handle that.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. One of the hardest things I think as a leader is terminating somebody. It's a gut wrenching experience, particularly if it's somebody that you know and you've worked with a long time and you trust them. And then they do something seriously that jeopardizes the entire company. And at that, maybe not the entire company, but at that moment in time, we had 2 contracts, and it would have jeopardized the one contract with the White House. And I was in Florida with Rob Franklin, and we get this phone call of the situation, and they're like, "What do we do?" I'm like, But Rob and I didn't hesitate. It was instantaneous. We looked at each other and says, he's got to go. We love him and we'll miss him, but we can't sacrifice 100 employees, 50 employees for one person. You just cannot do that. You have to look out for the overall best interest of the organization. And I think that's when, and he was a great performer, right? His work was incredible. So it wasn't like he was a poor performer. Getting rid of poor performers are easy, right? That's the easy job. The hard part is when it's a really good employer, top employee, top performer, and they do something that is cancerous to your organization. And I always tell entrepreneurs, like, if you have cancer in your organization, treat it like it's cancer in your body. Get rid of it as soon as you possibly can. You cannot drag that on. It will only grow. It will only fester. It will only infect. Just get rid of it as soon as you can, even if it's a top performer. We're all replaceable. And to include top performers, we can replace top performers. You hope to find somebody who's equal, if not better.
And that absolutely is critical, Bob. Now, the challenge I see with a lot of leaders and organizations is that if the person is a mediocre performer, the decision is easy and they act. A lot of organizations have those cancerous individuals or
Yes.
individuals that have a negative impact, but are extremely productive. And the organizations at the end of the day end up choosing that
Yes.
productivity over getting rid of the individual.
Oh, it really is. That's the hardest decision to make. Because particularly for small business, because you're thinking like, in a big business, you have redundancy. In a small business, and at that time, and even as we grew our commercial consulting practice, we ran into those situations. Like, you knew you needed to make the decision, but you look behind you and goes, who's the next man or woman up? And there isn't anybody back there. So you end up, look, it's easy for me to sit there and say, cancer, get rid of it. The reality is, you try to take the appropriate measures and move as quickly as possible, but it's really hard to do. And I get why people struggle with it, because so much of success is driven by the performance of the organization or your business unit. And you sitting there and go, I'm going to take out my top performer because they're cancer. I don't think so, right? Let me put them off in a place where they won't cause too much damage, but they'll still perform. And you do that. And look, that's one strategy to handle that. You try to isolate the infection. But I'll be honest with you. But from my experience, when you finally do make that decision and that top performer transitions out, the transition to fill that void usually doesn't take that long. And the organization looks at you and go, what took so long? My brother Ron believes in that philosophy that the community comes to a decision much quicker than leaders. And as leaders, the information you get gets filtered, right? Depending on where it can be filtered coming down or going up, but it gets filtered. And you're not making decisions based on all the appropriate data, right? But if you had the data that the masses have, right, you go, I should have made that a little bit quicker, because they always know that, yeah, we all saw that. We're not surprised that happened. We saw that like a year ago.
And it communicates a lot about the values of the leaders and the priorities of the organization and the culture the organization wants to have. So you did all of those things, and along with your good friend and partner Rob Franklin, grew the organization to over $200 million in revenue. Now, what I understand about most partnerships is that they don't last, and the rate of survival is much worse than marriages. How were you and Rob able to have the partnership last and still stay good friends?
Yeah, well, and to include my brother Ron Morgan.
And
So
Ron.
it was the three of us, and we we actually, for my brother and I particularly, when you go into business, we always had this rule that if it ever got to a point where it was going to damage our relationship as brothers, we needed to make a change. Um, I'll be honest with you, I honestly think it worked because the three of us were extremely self-aware. We all knew our strengths and weaknesses. And again, that's another lesson. When entrepreneurs ask me like, What are the characteristics? What are two things that are very important? I'm like, and there's always the finance, the strategy, and the actual product or technology you're developing and building. That's all you always needed. But beyond that, it's like I said, self-awareness and empathy. Like if you have self-awareness and empathy, you can build a strong team, right? So Ron and I all had self-awareness, and we knew what we were strong at and we knew what we were weak at. And we all filled in those gaps together. Uh, and then we also, too, the way we managed and talked and communicated, if Ron came with a proposal and he was very passionate and it was well thought out, and Rob and I didn't have too many concerns, we didn't argue, we didn't fight. We said, if you, we trusted him. So, and that happened between all three of us. It was this notion that we trust each other. And if you're that passionate about it, we're not going to question it. I think too many times in partnerships, people always have to win, right? They have to win. You always have that one person that always has to win, right? Well, that's not healthy. Like you don't need to. So the three of us just really were in sync. We probably over the course of 20 years, maybe had three really wicked arguments with each other, which is amazing. Kudos to Rob. We were at a point where like, where's this business going? And I sat around on my pool one weekend, probably had one or too many beers, and I just started thinking about our national security business and how we were going to fund the growth of that, and basically came to the conclusion that we needed to sell that business. I walk into Rob's office on Monday and I tell him and I explain it, and he's stunned because it's his business unit. He comes back 2 days later and goes, "You're right." He thought it through. And so we just worked that way, and then I'll be honest. And then, shortly thereafter, I was completely burnt out. And people always asked, "Bob, when are you going to step down?" And the answer was always the same. Because in this region, you always hear it's like, "I'm going to build this company for 10 years. Boom, I'm out." Right. And that's just, Todd Stottlemyre gave us some great advice. If you build a company to sell, you'll never build it. So we never set out to get 10 years, 15 years, X dollars of revenue. But when employees would ask me, when are you going to, I said, when I no longer have the energy and passion to show up, right? And this organization gets stale and stagnant and there's not a lot of chaos and not a lot of change, I'll probably step down. And shortly after we sold the national security business, um, we went and did an offsite for our consulting business, which now Ron is running. And I said, I left that. I said, I'm done. I'm fried. I'm toast. I got no energy out of that offsite. Now the hard decision came in is who's going to take over the company. And my brother has a lot of great talents and traits. He never expressed a lot of desire to do the role that I was doing, but he wanted an opportunity to run the company. And we had to have a hard conversation. I said, "Ron, we don't, it's not that we don't think you can do it. He said, we know you won't like doing it." Right? You've already said you don't want to do those things. I said, so when you don't like something, you don't focus on the right things. You focus on the things you like. And, he had to like take that in. And again, coming from his older brother and the CEO, he had to take that in, and he finally came back and says, "You're right. I really don't enjoy doing those things." And we made a decision to go hire C.E. Andrews to come in and run the company. So it's that kind of conversation that we were able to have, which saved us from really hating each other. And I hear so many of those horrific stories of longtime business partners who are no longer friends. That's heartbreaking. You spend that much time investing in each other, and then you walk away as just bitter and angry. That's not the way you want to close out your business career and something like that.
There's a lot of brilliant advice in there for all kinds of leaders, whether in partnerships or not. That self awareness is absolutely critical. And sometimes the individuals can help each other increase their self awareness. So, with the conversations with your brother, when there's a trusting relationship, you did that. And then the empathy it takes. So, obviously, you had all of those helping grow Morgan Franklin to the size that you did. But it sounds like you have not retired. You just moved on from Morgan Franklin. Now CEO of Talaria Media, founder of Pivotal Moments, managing partner of Caneel, co-founder of GoodSeeker. So what do you do with your free time, dear Bob?
Um, Fortunately, the Talaria Media and a lot of the things are more creative in nature. So that to me is actually relaxing. I'm it's not the urgency of running a national security business or making sure we got a team of people that supports Coca-Cola or somebody like that. So the stress level is definitely off. But Caneel is to be honest, Caneel is probably the coolest thing because I wanted to set up a business where I could give my three sons an opportunity to help grow. So Caneel, actually, we invest in startups, we invest in venture capital and private equity. We actually, through Caneel, purchased the 330-acre farm back in Pennsylvania. That my sons are now creating ideas to use that property for different business ventures. So it gives them an opportunity to think creatively and entrepreneurially, at the same time being stewards of the family and what we've created and built. So that's a really cool thing. And again, that's a little bit of work that I do. Talaria Media, I've had the opportunity to, I'm now working on my fourth or fifth film. So I've helped create cut several documentaries, a psychological thriller that's coming out. I'm partnering with folks in LA. So that taps into my creativity. And I do believe entrepreneurs are creative in their own right. So I just channeled my entrepreneurship creativity into film and media. And then Pivotal Moments is really one of those outlets that, one of the things we were proud of at Morgan Franklin was we created a CSR program very early on when we were barely making any money. I had Ron and I had our grandparents, sitting on our shoulder going, make sure you do it the right way. You give back to your community, you give back to people who need. And Rob Franklin grew up in a blue collar home from New Jersey. So we all had this feeling like we're here because of people and people helped us. Like it's got to be baked in our DNA that we're going to help people. We're going to help organizations. And we did that. But then I stepped down. I didn't have it. So I'm like, okay, I'll create my own. Well, I'll be honest with you, like creating a 501c3 is probably harder than creating any business. But it's we're at a point now where we're really focused on, again, telling uplifting, inspiring stories, but also creating education around mental fitness. There's so much going on in the world. 25 to 30% of young people are dealing with mental health issues. This was pre-pandemic. It's way worse now. I think that a report came out in Virginia that 95% of students are dealing with anxiety, right? It's some ridiculous number, but all these alarming statistics, right? And we really need to like start focusing on mental fitness earlier and more often. I joke with people. I said, as soon as we go off to uh, kindergarten or elementary school, they're talking about physical fitness, physical education. I said, now that I'm 53, my doctors are even more adamant about physical fitness. I said, where in that journey do we talk about our mental fitness, right? We need to train ourselves to overcome adversity. We need all those things to get stronger as we grow. And we just don't talk about it enough. And now we're riddled with stigma and all these other things. And so that's a personal passion. Again, I dealt with it when I had cancer, unbeknownst to me. It manifested itself years later. I'm like, oh yeah, because there was a time where I ripped the IV out of my arm and I checked myself out of the hospital at midnight. And I'm like, I'm done with this. I don't care if I die. I'm done. I obviously overcame that and just moved on. And then having kids who are in their 20s, you just see that, if 30% of young people are dealing with it, that's at least one of my children and, a third of all their friends. So it's just so prevalent. Like we got to do something. And, through storytelling, right? Sharing uplifting stories of people fighting through adversity, acknowledging that we all have issues with anxiety and depression, and professional athletes have it, musicians have it, CEOs have it, entrepreneurs have it, I have it. There are times where you probably have it. Like, if we just start talking about it more and sharing, then we'll get through the stigma. We'll eradicate the stigma. So that's pivotal moments. We're super psyched about that. I'm building out a fantastic team of people who love to create content, tell stories, and focus on a problem that, like I said, that's probably we're probably 100% of us are dealing with at some point. So yeah, I am busy. My wife tells me I got business ADD because I cannot stop. But it's all very passionate and enjoyable work at this time.
You still have a lot of energy and you're channeling it into great causes and great efforts. Now, I'm wondering, you shared a lot of leadership advice through your own journey. When people ask you, Bob, if there are any leadership resources that you typically refer to or recommend, what comes to mind?
Um, I, yeah, unfortunately, I don't read a lot of books just because I don't have a lot of time. I love the parable books, Who Moved My Cheese and The Present. Um, Kind of those kind of like very simple books that, again, they tell a story, but if you're a storyteller, you get it, you get those things. One of the things I would recommend is I always took a week and went to the World Business Forum in New York City, and it was a week where I could get away, not be in meetings, not on phone calls, and you just get to listen to some of the countries and world's best speakers talk about business, but also talk about bigger issues. And I always found myself taking that time to really think creatively, because you're sitting there listening to inspiring people. So if you can't get inspired and come up with ideas, the company Morgan Franklin always hated when I went there because they knew when I came back it was going to be this avalanche of new ideas. But I think Bill Gates, that his advice about getting out of the office, taking a 2 week vacation or 3 week vacation. Most of us can't take that much time, but if you can, at least take a week and go read and just, again, and I'm not talking about, you can read business books, you can read leadership books, sprinkle that in with some fun and getting back to nature and doing those kind of things. I've gotten really into hiking, just walking in the woods and just being in nature and just clearing your head. Though, I mean, business books get a little, dry and mundane because they have about 15 pages of really good lessons that they span out over 220 pages. That's my advice. It's just, find time for you to be alone and introspective. Um, we have Tammy bought an infrared sauna blanket, which it's
What
like a
is
sleep.
that?
It's a sleeping bag that it's like sitting in a sauna in a spa, only you're in like a sleeping bag, and it gets up to 160 degrees. You're sweating, but you're laying there confined. And I always find myself while I'm in there coming up with new ideas. I've actually created 2 TV shows sitting in this blanket because it's 45, 50 minutes of isolation. You're locked in and you got nothing but time to just think. You're not reading emails, you're not looking at your phone, you're not distracted. So to me, carving out time to like, and again, that's where, and if you're strong about self-awareness and empathy, that's where you can actually sit back and go, okay, what's my feedback? What am I doing? The other thing too is like, I had a life coach after I stepped down from Morgan Franklin. I wasn't quite sure who I was at that moment in time. And I think that happens with a lot of successful people. Anytime people transition, you kind of feel lost for a little bit. So, and I definitely was lost. And I was thinking about, doing more work out in Los Angeles and all these other things. And I ended up with a life coach. And one thing I recommend to any business leader is do this exercise called the Wheel of Life. It's a shocking discovery of how unbalanced your life is. My life did not look like a nice, smooth, round wheel. It looked more like an egg. So it just tells you areas that you need to work on. Doesn't mean that you don't focus on creating business and wealth and all that other stuff, but maybe carve out some time to spend more time with your kids or your wife, or more time for yourself, and do those kind of things. Uh,
And goes to the point that you have highlighted all throughout, the importance of self-awareness. One of the things I find is as people move up in organizations and have more business success, sometimes because of the limited feedback that they get from the external world and the people around them, their self-awareness goes down. So what made you so effective, and part of what post Morgan Franklin you had to do, is to increase your own self-awareness too.
yeah. Well, that you just, if you move up in the leadership ranks, you have to still let people, you have to acknowledge that you're open to feedback, right? I think there is this habit that the more responsibility you get, the higher on the ladder you go, the more closed off you need to become. That's actually the opposite. You actually need to be more open. And then too, you also tend to start living off reports and data coming out of your information system. I think there was a study that came out a number of years ago from the British about their CEOs, and 70% of them made most of their decisions based on informal communication that they received just through walking through the office, not through their information systems. And this pandemic, I've actually had a lot of conversations about the future of office space, and I hear this you know idea that we're never going to go back to the office and it's going to be remote working, and I'm like, that's the death of a company culture. It's also the death of innovation, because there's a number of folks, a good friend of mine, that we talk about collisions in the office space, right? That collision theory, that when you actually just randomly bump into somebody and have that conversation, you actually get information feedback about yourself, number one, right? So that helps you become more self-aware. But you also have that opportunity to have that bolt of lightning that creates innovation and spurns new things. So I fundamentally believe that when the pandemic is over and it's safe and all the precautions, people need to get back to work. We're not meant to sit in our homes all by ourselves. We're meant to interact with people, and that means physically interact, and emotionally, and so all those kind of things. I just think if we're going to get healthy again, we need to get people back in the office colliding with each other. My niece works for a consulting company, and she just told me the other day, she goes, I miss that 10-minute conversation. Everything is Zoom's over, click off, join the next Zoom. Like, where's that 10-minute buffer of just conversation about life? I just find it really unhealthy if companies choose to go, we're just going to let everybody work remote. I'm like, beyond that, beyond the social and emotional impacts, I think what's going to happen is, and this is just Bob's philosophy, but if you let people work remotely, your turnover rate is going to go through the roof. And whatever you saved in office space, you're going to pay in recruiting costs because it's coming.
I couldn't agree with you more, Bob. There is a futurist, Tron Dundheim. I actually talked to him a few months back on this podcast. And part of what he also says is that there has to be going back to the office space and some environment where people get a chance to interact, both for innovation. And he jokingly says that for years when he worked for Oracle, he shared more in common with some of the competitors than he did with other people that he worked with at Oracle,
Hmm.
because some of those relationships are built based on what you say, those colliding with each other.
Yeah,
And innovation comes from that colliding with each other rather than pre programmed conversations
yeah.
through technology.
Yeah, it's, technology is great. And I think we've proven that we can give people the opportunity for flexible work schedules, right? Which I think that's the advancement we made. It's like there's no excuse to not offer flexibility, but that doesn't, I was out at the Facebook campus for a tour before the pandemic. And the young lady that's taking us around the tour, like most of the tour was in the common ground where they have the restaurants and the bars and the ice cream shops and the picnic tables. And she's like, basically, we convert food into code, right? But there's this lively, energetic environment. Like you strip away that, now you just got people banging on a keyboard, not thinking they're part of anything, right? My job. So I think there's a reason why that environment was so successful. And I don't believe Silicon Valley's going to scrap that. I just don't like. I wouldn't advise it. I just think, if you're just going to let people work from home and create code, you might as well just have a bunch of independent contractors and you know and again, the tail end of that is you're not going to have that creativity. There's just no way.
Absolutely.
We've been talking about storytelling. How are they going to share stories? Nobody's sharing any stories on these Zoom calls.
And that's why when you look at whether it's Amazon's HQ2 in Arlington, Alexandria, or other tech companies, they are still building big
Yes.
campuses to try to get people together.
Hmm.
So that's going to be critical. Now, I know, as I mentioned, this is the first of many conversations with you, Bob, because you are continuing to do great things. Really appreciate you sharing some of your leadership journey, some of your success with the partnering leadership community. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation, Bob Morgan.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. It's been enjoyable, and it's sorry we've been so distant. Like I'm dying to actually get back and see my friends from LGW and start doing those events again. I miss everybody, and again, these virtual things are okay, but this just doesn't cut it. So it was great to catch up. Hopefully, we'll see you in person here soon, and we can continue having more conversations. So thank you very
Looking
much.
looking forward to it, Bob. Thank you.